Good evening. For those that don't know me, I'm Bob Lavoie. I'm from Amesbury. I'm on the Amesbury City Council now. Born and raised in Amesbury. I've been married for about 37 years, so I wouldn't be here without the support of my family, and of course they're in the audience, along with a lot of other friends and supporters for both candidates. I'd like to thank the three committees who put this together. We thought we might do a couple of them, but this is better. It's a bigger critical mass in a great venue. I'm glad to be here. Once I got out of law school and started my career, I looked around for other opportunities for community service. My whole life has been filled with community service, from Boy Scouting on up. I'm an Eagle Scout. I was president of the Boy Scout Council. The call to politics, if you will, I served one summer at the State House with then existing Representative Bernie Flynn from Amesbury. Great guy. I learned a lot, got the bug. So when Mayor Hilt asked me to help Amesbury, I was very glad to participate, and I chaired the Master Plan Committee, went on to the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, and here I am today.
Thank you, Mr. Lavoie. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ronald Lee, for moderating this, and thank you to the chairs of the committees and the committees themselves for sponsoring this event, and thank you, Bob, for what I hope will be a good night for both of us, and we can come out strong after the primary on September 9th. I am a city councilor here in Newburyport. I'm serving my 4th term. I'm not a lifelong resident, although I am a lifelong resident of Massachusetts. Although I'm not from this area, I know we share our hatred of the Yankees, so I know there are always ways where we can find some common bonds. I live here really because I met my wife, Suzanne, who's in the back there, in 2001. And we have 2 children who are home because it's a school night, so they're not here joining us. And I am a lifelong Democrat. I was raised by 2 Republicans, which is not quite as interesting as being raised by wolves, but it's somewhat similar. My parents, my mom's no longer with us, but my dad is. Great people, and we share the same values. We might not have shared the same politics, but the values are really for working people, for the underdog, and I think that's what the United States and Massachusetts are all about. I got my start here locally in politics, volunteering on campaigns, in a mayoral campaign with Mayor Holliday, working for Deval Patrick, later working for John Tierney and Mike Costello and Elizabeth Warren. I've met many of you that way, and that's really why I got involved. And why I got involved on the city council is really why you get involved as activists, is because something was wrong. I was upset about the waterfront and our educational system in 2007. Got involved, and it's all been downhill from there. So very happy to be here tonight. Looking forward to talking to the issues that you've been talking to me about as I've been knocking on doors across these 3 communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. So I will try to remember to flip-flop, so you gentlemen may have to keep me on task with that. So for the first question, this is to you first, Mr. Cameron. What would be your top 3 priorities as state rep? What committee assignments would you seek? And as a freshman rep, how would you get your voice heard?
A lot can be said in 2 minutes, so I'm going to try to say it. The 3 issues that I think are the top of mind as I'm talking to people across the district, and really were some of the reasons I got involved in are, first of all, local education and state support for it and lack thereof. I think there's a lot we can do. Both Bob and I have been talking about different ideas. I know there are many groups working within the district in Amesbury and in Newburyport and in Salisbury, trying to connect with statewide efforts to reform the Chapter 70 funding that we get, particularly working to improve the amount of money, but also the fairness. There are certain winners and losers across different school districts. There is definitely a groundswell of interest in working on that. Local aid is a big issue. When I knock on doors, people don't talk about local aid, but they talk about broken streets and sidewalks. They talk about reduced fire and police personnel. They talk about reduced services and hours at libraries. Those are all things that we can improve if state local aid that comes back to communities can get back to the 2002 levels. The third thing connects those two, and it also connects with economic development, and that's transportation. I'm right now a commuter to Lowell. 495 is a disaster. My wife goes into Boston, that's a disaster. Here locally, we don't have the funds to have our streets and sidewalks the way we want. So those are the three. In terms of if and when I'm elected, being on certain committees, there are 160 state representatives. I don't presume to have a magic wand and go down and spread some fairy dust and make people put me on the committees I want to be. I really want to try to, if I can get on, have a say in it, get on education or transportation. Ways and Means is really the most important, because that's the committee that directs where the money goes. I want to work very closely with Senator Ives, who I'm hoping will be reelected. She's currently on the chair's Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development. I think that'd be a nice connection to find a complementary committee to be involved in and work with her.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Lavoie?
Thank you. So I, likewise, as people can tell from my campaign literature and in my career in 9 years on the Amesbury City Council, economic development is key, crucial to everything. It's the building block. Without further growth and development, there are no funds available for much more than keeping the status quo, fighting inflation. So the other major issue that I'm concerned about is education. So the Education Committee at the House of Representatives is definitely a committee I want to serve on. Ways and Means is the critical committee. They limit membership. It'll be a real tough slog, but it's important that this district representative, whoever it is, serve on that committee. It's where funds get allocated. It's the heart and soul of everything. And then finally, basically, to prove your worth to the rest of the membership and the leadership of the House, you have to approach things with a spirit of cooperation and team building. And I believe I excel at that. People who know me, know my record, know that I have a good way of getting people to come together. Everybody approaches things from a different angle, but there is a lot of common ground. The trick is to find that common ground and to persuade people that, in fact, there is a way to compromise. And that's basically my other key thing in my platform is basically, compromise is not a dirty word. Our founding fathers compromised all the time. That's why the Constitution looks the way it does. It's worked pretty well. And we have to get back to finding ways so that we can reach across the aisle, get things done, and otherwise we're just going to have the same type of stagnation that we've had.
Thank you, Mr. Lavoie. After each question, we will allow a 1-minute rebuttal. So, Mr. Cameron.
Yeah, not so much as a rebuttal, it's just adding a little to what Bob was talking about in terms of economic development. And to me, the three priorities I mentioned first, education, local aid, and transportation, those are all key foundational aspects of economic development in order to have a prosperous economy, a regional economy. And I very much believe that all three communities are very connected. We're in each other's communities, crossing bridges to go to restaurants, to go to schools, to go shopping, to go to different beaches. In our case, it's to go to Hodges and Leo's Super Bowl, and also Joe's Playland. You know, there's a lot of commonality between the three communities. If we have an educated workforce, our streets and sidewalks and our local government is functioning well, and our transportation system is better, we're all going to be the better off for it.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie, any additional comments?
No, I just go back to, for our district, economic development means different things for each municipality. Salisbury Beach is prime for redevelopment, tourism-centered. Newburyport has always been the envy of the region in terms of the industrial park. There's limited additional area where development can happen. By the train station, there's a great project that's underway. They say that retail follows residential. Putting in the right kind of residential will lead to the right type of retail. And the whole key is to get additional economic development so that the funds that we need for local education and other things will flow from the increased tax base.
Thank you. Now to Mr. Lavoie. So we're already getting good at switching it. The Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993 established school foundation budgets as a means of ensuring that every community had sufficient means to educate its students regardless of property taxes. Lawmakers on the Education Committee are considering reestablishing a Foundation Budget Review Commission to review and recalculate the foundation budget. Do you support such legislation? Why or why not?
I definitely support it, and if I'm not incorrect. Especially with Katie Ives in the Senate, they did manage to get that passed as part of the budget process. That commission will get revitalized, and I've read the legislation. It's excellent legislation. The difficulty with Chapter 70 is that the foundation budget does need to be looked at. In terms of what I view, however, as the most pressing need, as a city councilor doing budgeting in Amesbury, the last 2 cycles, we've given approximately 80 to 90% of the new available funds to the schools. And they need more, they want more. There's just not more to give. Part of what's creating the crisis in education, local education financing, is the poor way that special education is financed. There's a thing called the circuit breaker, which starts out with a basis and has never been properly funded. My view, and one of the first things I would work on if I'm elected, is to convince the rest of my fellow legislators that the time has come to finance special education the way that veteran services have been financed. The way veteran services are financed for those who do municipal budget is basically that 75% of the cost of veteran services provided by each municipality every year is automatically reimbursed to them the following year. It helps with certainty of budgeting, and just like veteran services, everybody believes and knows that the right thing to do is provide quality special education services. But it's a societal obligation. It's not just the property taxpayer in each municipality that has the obligation. So society at large, our Commonwealth, should supply the 75% of that financing. 25% is a fair obligation, and towns and cities, I think, would be glad to participate in that. So again, I'm in favor of the commission. I look forward to working with it, but I'm going to press forward with my own agenda, which is to try to get that 75% reimbursement instituted.
Thank you, Ms. Lavoie. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you. Certainly, like Bob, I agree that now is a very important time to address the educational funding inequities across the state. Right now, we're still operating really under the rubric of the 1993 Educational Reform Act. That was a great advance for Massachusetts. I think that was one of the legislative efforts that helped propel us to be, believe it or not, #1 in the country. And it's great to be #1 in the country, but when our whole country is lagging behind other industrialized nations, we still have a long ways to go. And to get better, we've got to deal with the funding, make it more predictable for local school districts. I think Bob's idea about the 75% reimbursement is somewhat similar to circuit breaker in some ways, but it's definitely something we should look at. I think regionalizing should be looked at in a whole range of different functions of government as ways to increase services and save some money. But the real crux of it is getting to the formula and getting to the raw amount that goes into that formula. When that formula was created, healthcare costs for teachers and school personnel weren't as high, and as Bob said, special education costs weren't so high. I agree with Bob. We absolutely have a responsibility as a society and as government to make sure that students get the special services that they need. I don't think anyone wants to see this become winners and losers. We want all our kids to be winners. That's absolutely the way we need to go. We need to be running it like a business. A lot of times people will say, well, government should run like a business, and it absolutely should. We shouldn't be slashing and burning school districts, teacher salaries, aides. We should be investing in those services and those resources so our kids can have the best education that we can offer them. I know there's been a lot of talk at the local level with different groups in Amesbury and Newburyport and Salisbury. We're trying to connect more with North Shore, Merrimack Valley, and that's really how the change is going to happen. It's going to happen from the bottom up, but it's going to tie into these other statewide efforts that, as Bob mentioned, Senator Ives commissioned to study this will head us in the right direction.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Lavoie, rebuttal?
I agree 100% it's going to happen from the bottom up. A very good analogy was healthcare costs for the public sector. Well, municipalities had to fight about 10 years to convince the state to give our municipalities, the 3 cities and towns in our district, as well as the other Commonwealth cities and towns, the ability to do plan design for healthcare. The state said, no, we can't trust you with that. Well, you know what? If it's good enough for the state, it's good enough for us. so that from the ground up, we need to address and get coalitions building, which there's a lot of activity going on this summer among city councilors and selectmen across the state. Getting to the formula, I view the formula like the Internal Revenue Code. It may be possible once in a generation to straighten it out. I think it's important to look at. I think the commission will do important work. But again, I come back to my central goal will be to get special education funded the way it should be.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, any additional remarks?
No.
Thank you.
Ronald, I forgot to tell you that 10 to 15 minutes into the debate, we're going to collect your questions that you've written on index cards. So if you could hand them in now. Rebecca Jordan, Chair of the Engineering Committee, it would be great. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay, Charlie.
I would like to add one thing. Special ed isn't something for those people or somebody else. It's really all of us. Anyone who's had children in the school system, and I know we've all been children. These are kids that need our support, that need to be part of the community. Inclusion is great when we can do that, but sometimes there need to be other additional services. Many of our friends have had to deal with bureaucracy in school systems to try to get the best services, so it really is something that we have a shared responsibility in.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Next question. Massachusetts women currently earn 80.5% of what men earn. House Bill 1415 has been proposed to better define comparable worth, given that fields dominated by female employees pay significantly less than those dominated by male workers. Will you support House Bill 1415? Why or why not? So, Mr. Cameron.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly I support any efforts, whether that be at the federal or state or local level, to make sure that we have comparable pay for similar jobs that are similar in skills, similar in effort, similar in responsibility. There is a House bill, it's actually not 1415, it's 1767, which was recently folded into a different House bill, and I think there has been some progress made on that over the summer. It's definitely an issue we should continue to push forward on. 24 states across the country have similar bills, and it's really establishing standards and equal pay laws so that we can ensure that there's a level playing field. It's not so much a government mandate that's heavy-handed and yet more of a burden on business, but it's really just establishing the regulatory framework that's going to help make sure that women get the same pay as men.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
Yes, certainly I support the concept. As I mentioned, there are many bills that have been filed. This is a perennial bill that gets filed, usually gets shuffled off to committee. It's hard to disagree with it. I certainly agree with the premise that there should be equal pay for equal work. But to address that, you have to address a whole host of issues, from economic development to caregiver services. As they say, the devil is in the details. Probably since Adam and Eve, people have been talking about this concept, and here we are. All of us are born and raised in families that at least 50% of the household is, female. We just happen to be, from a gender point of view, that we're sitting here saying, of course, because again, everyone believes in it. It's the right thing to do, and it's the fair thing to do, because if there's any type of inequality when it comes to wages, for any reason, gender or otherwise, it diminishes the economic opportunities that should be available to everybody in society. So equal pay for equal work is a no-brainer. It's amazing it hasn't passed yet, but again, trying to nail it down in a way that is really workable has proven to be beyond some of the legislatures, and if I get in, it'll be one of the top issues that I tackle.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, rebuttal?
Yeah, this is one of a whole series of women's issues that I think are important to all of us, whether, regardless of our gender. I know we are probably at a time where, since a lot of these bills kind of get shuffled off to committee over the years, that there may be time for a change, because we've come so far in other areas that are important to men and women, and also to gay and lesbian people as well. And part of that is that we have more women in the legislature. Katie Ives is not the only one. And although there are 6 competitors, 6 candidates for the seat that Bob and I are running for that are all men, unfortunately, we are seeing more women in the legislature, so hopefully this is a way that we can all work together. And I just want to add, we live in this society, we didn't create this, we didn't necessarily wish this to be the way that things are, but we have come a long way. I know in my own family, my mother and father both had college degrees. They were both from poor families, but they did pretty well. And my mother just, she never got the career kind of off to a footing like my father did. And although he would admit and she would admit that she was much smarter and skilled than he was, he always made more money. So it's time to change that.
That goes without saying.
Mr. Lavoie, any more remarks?
No, it really does go without saying. The only reason that men think they're in charge is because our wives let us.
Okay, next question to Mr. Lavoie first. The amount of local aid provided by the state to local communities, including the 3 in your district, fell sharply after the 2007-2008 economic crisis. What can be done to return local aid to its pre-crisis levels?
That is the $64 question. The amazing thing is we've gone through municipal budgeting. Again, I've been on the council for 9 years and done 9 budgets. It's amazing the drastic change that happened of the $10 million that Amesbury has devoted to educational enhancements over the last few years. $9 million of the dollars came from Amesbury itself, the state of Pony #1. And I think, believe it or not, that if you stop and think about it, the largest source of unrestricted local aid is the lottery. Okay? So the lottery came in when I was in high school, so like 40 years ago, and it wasn't automatically popular then, and it's kind of a strange way to raise revenue. But as everybody knows, everybody likes to buy a scratch ticket every once in a while. Supporting the lottery to the extent that people care to is an essential way to ensure that local aid continues. What the state did, which was completely wrong, is they sold the program as this would be for local aid, and then when bad times hit, they raided it. So they basically starved the cities and towns of local aid financing that should have been provided. The only other way to raise local aid is to basically change the balance of what services are being provided. Because at the end of the day, government doesn't create money and it doesn't create jobs. Everybody in the audience creates their own money, and they have those that provide jobs in small and larger businesses. They're the jobs creators. The way and the role for states is to provide a proper playing field where law is enforced. And so just wishing more local aid won't happen. We could raise taxation, but again, money come out of the private sector and the public sector. It's not the recipe that we need.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, this would be one of my top three priorities. And I'd even say that cuts in local aid predate 2007. It was really 2002 when we had some severe cutbacks at the state level, and we're still bearing the brunt of that. Decreased local aid from the state essentially means more pressure on all of our property tax. We know anyone who's served locally in municipal government, that is a constant battle balancing the limited ways that we have to raise revenue with the overwhelming demand for services. So, I think, how do we get the funding where it is? I mean, we don't cut the income tax for one thing, and we don't cut the sales tax. If you want to do that, that's great, but you're going to have to figure out what you want to cut at the local level. Again, businesses invest in themselves and then end up producing more revenue down the road. We need to provide for those basic city services, the schools, the police, fire, libraries. In Newburyport, a couple of years ago, we got, and I see Councilor Tom Jones out there, he'll remember this, we got more protest about reductions in a couple of staff for the library than we did for firefighters. And that doesn't mean that people don't care about safety. That means that people love their libraries. And I know that's true about all three communities. There have been a lot of discussions in Amesbury about their library, a new one coming on in Salisbury. I mean, that's what we're talking about, really the basics. In terms of Chapter 90 and municipal and state funding for streets and sidewalks, that gets hit when local aid gets hit. And you know, streets and sidewalks are an issue for all three communities. I know as a Newburyport City Councilor, it's probably issue number one: sidewalk, 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 pothole, sidewalk, sidewalk, sidewalk. So you know, we need to look at all of that. I also think we need more local options at the municipal level. I was somebody who pushed for a local meals tax. I got a lot of flack for that in one term, and then the next term it passed pretty handily. That's brought in $400,000 for Newburyport, and we've used most of that for streets and sidewalks, actually, and that's been a way to kind of push back against that. But we need to find it at the state level.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Mr. Lavoie?
Yes, getting back to the source of local aid, again, every dollar that the state has is basically a dollar that they've taken from us. Everyone in the room believes in paying their fair share, but again, the only way to enhance the ability of businesses and individuals to raise more revenue is through economic development. And that's where I think the state plays a key role, whether it's in terms of transportation improvements. In the old days, we called them PWID grants, Public Works, Economic Development Grants, and Amesbury's been the beneficiary of one of those, most recently in the Lower Mill Yard. And it's that type of state aid that definitely needs to be continued and enhanced so that towns can have the ability to grow their own economic base. And if all 351 cities and towns grow their own economic base, the entire Commonwealth situation will improve and revenue will be available to help give back to us in local aid.
Thank you. Additional remarks?
Just one other. I think you know, a place where we can find state money without raising taxes is in healthcare costs. Almost 50% of the state budget goes towards healthcare in one way, shape, or form. Sometimes that's for state employees. A lot of the local aid that we get, unfortunately, goes to healthcare costs to cover municipal employees. Those costs have just mushroomed over the years. I think we need a conversation, as some of the governor candidates have talked about, a conversation about single payer as a way to rein in costs. Right now we have the most insane bureaucratic multi-party healthcare system in the world, with insurers, providers that are jockeying for leverage against each other. Places like Anna Jake's community hospitals are kind of the last islands of sanity in this system. We need to look at a different way, otherwise we're just going to keep pouring money into a healthcare system that doesn't give us the results that we need. I think that's a way for us to save some money at the state level and direct that to our local needs.
Thank you. Next question to Mr. Cameron. What would you say should be the environmental priorities in our district? Beach erosion, brownfields, Newburyport landfill, open space parks, storm surge. Is there more the state can do and our state reps can do to address these issues?
Great question, and the key word there is prioritize, and how do you prioritize all of those? Every one of those that you mentioned is a serious issue before us. To me, a couple rise to the highest level. First is the Crow Lane landfill. If you want to know the impact that state government can have on local people, you need look no further. The city of Newburyport made a mistake years ago, signed an agreement with a landfill operator, and basically, you know, as a small city, kind of found itself outgunned by a pretty heavy-duty operator. And we need a strong governor and a strong AG's office to help us deal with issues like that. We're 95% at closure, but those of us who represent the constituents in those areas know that it's still an ongoing concern with the odors. That I would put at the top of my list. We certainly need to be looking at erosion issues, climate change, storm surge. That's all impacting right now with Salisbury Beach and Plum Island. We need to, you know, get our heads around what the possible impacts are down the road. This applies to Amesbury as well because of the river and the flooding that we've had there. We had the Mother's Day floods a few years ago that impacted Amesbury quite severely. And I'd also add, state support for some of the flood control projects in Salisbury with Blackwater River and the Town Creek. I mean, those are very important issues that Senator Ives and Representative Costello have pushed, and that's going to be really important. I think finally, if there's any sort of environmental mitigation needed for Newburyport's waterfront, I think that's going to be a key issue for our next state representative. Many of us who live here in Newburyport have been involved on all different sides of trying to get that to completion. I think right now we're at a good consensus where people want a lot more park, a little bit of parking, and a visitor center. I think that is going to need some state support, particularly if we need a couple $100,000 just to make sure that that ground is uncontaminated.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
On the environment, there's quite a bit the state can do. The state regulates a lot of environmental matters through the Department of Environmental Protection, DEP. As Mr. Cameron's mentioned, DEP has come to Newburyport on the landfill issue. The fact that that's still going on and still a problem is just amazing, not only to the people in Newburyport, but also in the surrounding cities. I view, part of this question is, as a state rep, what could or would you do with respect to the environmental issues? I view the state representative position, and Mike Costello's done a fantastic job, definitely being an advocate for the locality, and also running interference, because a lot of times the state bureaucrats will basically take the attitude about, I'm going to send them a letter, and I'll mark the file ahead 6 months, and they'll forget about it. And if you don't have a good advocate, people working for the three communities that's knowledgeable in the area, then each of the municipalities is going to have trouble getting their own programs done. Our own three municipalities differ in what they need from environmental protection. Amesbury, as an early industrial mill city, there were nails being made in Amesbury in the late 1600s, believe it or not. So our Lower Mill Yard is one of our biggest economic development projects going on, and we needed, and luckily were provided by the state with a lot of assistance in terms of remediating the brownfield conditions we find down there. Mike Costello, as our state rep, stepped up, and that's the type of footsteps I'd like to follow in.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Yeah, just to add, those are some of the issues that we need to face, and the way you get at those is somewhat through collaboration and relationship building, and other times it's really being the squeaky wheel that needs to get the grease, and I think Mike and Senator Ives and Senator Baddour before Senator Ives did a good job of that and advocated for us. Again, I haven't seen the results that we need on Crow Lane, but we got to keep pushing on that. I know I've talked to Attorney General candidates and gubernatorial candidates about that. I know Mayor Holliday has as well. We need to be banging away on these issues and not going along on other things until we get the results that we need. I also want to mention one other big issue in this district, and it's not actually in this district, it's the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant. I am opposed to relicensing. I appreciate the education that has been given me by some folks in the audience who are part of the No More Fukushimas group. And over time, as I've looked at it, I have come to favor decommissioning sooner rather than later. We certainly need to find other sources of energy to fill that gap there, but that plant has outlived its usefulness. The owner is just trying to get more revenue out of it, similar to a landfill issue, same kind of revenue stream. They've built it, and now they're trying to get more profit out of that, but we need to start shutting that down sooner rather than later. It's very dangerous to have that, and evacuation would be very difficult for the 118,000 people in the 10-mile radius.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Lavoie?
I agree 100% in terms of that the relicensing effort, should go nowhere. In terms of whether the plant is safe now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is in charge of that. I think as local officials, it's important for us to assess what's in the best interest of each of our communities and to communicate that. in terms of replacing that energy, that's a critical function, and you know, that needs to be looked in before any precipitous closing occurs. But again, safety is paramount. It's the most unpopular public, let's say, publicly tolerated facility in our region. Thank God the prevailing winds from the west 90% of the time. None of us like living in the shadow. We couldn't control it. It's here. We're dealing with it. The sooner it passes its useful life, the better.
Thank you. The next question is going to be a fun, interesting question. It's called the lightning round. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and each candidate will give a yes or no answer to the following questions. After you have done so, you will have the opportunity to explain your answers on any questions. So we're going to go through this just as a yes, no, and at the end they can make any additional comments. Okay, I'm going to start with Mr. Lavoie, and I'll try to switch it for this too. Do you support a woman's right to have an abortion?
Yes.
Mr. Cameron?
Yes.
Should women have the right to enter an abortion clinic without being confronted by protesters or opponents of the right to choose? Mr. Cameron?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you favor allowing in-state tuition for undocumented residents of Massachusetts? Mr. Lavoie?
No.
Yes.
Do you favor allowing undocumented residents of Massachusetts to have driver's license? Mr. Cameron?
Yes.
Mr. Lavoie?
Yes, I do.
Do you support the Trust Act asking police to not hold undocumented immigrants for ICE unless a serious crime has been committed? Mr. Lavoie?
Yes.
Yes.
Do you support an increase in the minimum wage? Mr. Cameron?
Oh, yes.
Definitely yes.
And last one, do you support recently enacted legislation to control guns? Mr. Lavoie?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any additional comments? We will start with Mr. Cameron.
I thought lightning round, if I answered one wrong, or Bob did, we'd get struck by lightning, so that's good.
Yeah.
We can lighten up a little bit now. You know, I mean, all great questions, and it's actually kind of nice answering yes or no for a change, because there's a lot of thought when you have to give a more substantive answer. But I just want to touch on minimum wage. I know that's been somewhat controversial. Two bills worked their way through separately through the House and through the Senate. And what we ended up with, I think, is a good compromise. It's not indexed, but it has a substantial increase to $11 an hour, and I think that's a good start. And it's really about the fact that since the 1970s, wages for lower income people, middle income people, and even upper middle income people have stayed flat. And those in the top 5%, certainly the top 1%, they're you know, indexed wages to inflation have gone through the roof. And we need to make this a society that works for anybody who can work and wants to work. You know, I work in the field of homelessness and have done that for 27 years. I have talked to drunken Skid Row alcoholics who I will, you know, said to at the Pine Street Inn, you know, back in the 80s, you know, Harry, what do you need? What do you want? I want a job. You know, somebody who can barely stand. I mean, there's a real work ethic in this country. I still think it's there. I think we need to get the jobs by investing here in our country rather than sending corporate investment overseas. And I think that can rise the whole tide for all ships and people at the minimum wage level. That'll help them be more self-sufficient.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
Yeah, the only expansion I wanted to give to any of the answers, of those 7 questions, 3 of them dealt with immigration issues. And, you know, for example, you know, I am not in favor of in-state tuition for undocumented residents, but it's qualified in the following sense. Unless there's some balancing of the interest there. For example, there are plenty of documented immigrants as well as other people that don't have the financial wherewithal to even pay the in-state tuitions. So if there was some balance brought to it, that additional scholarships would be made available for the neediest so that they too could have an opportunity to go to college. That's why I have a qualified no on that question. And then in terms of the Trust Act, I mean, the key thing that I highlighted on the question is, you know, so I'm in favor of the Trust Act, but it should go into the definition of serious crimes. You know, I don't know about you, but you know, there are some moving violations that no, I wouldn't necessarily, rat somebody out to ICE for, but, if there are bad actors in the community, they shouldn't be here, so.
Thank you. And I think we'll be able to do one more question before the 45 minutes to stay true to our time. So the last question before I take the index cards, and if I got all of my L's and C's right, I think we're on Mr. Cameron. There are 4 ballot initiatives before Massachusetts voters this fall on repealing the 2013 law that increases gas taxes according to inflation, expanding the beverage container recycle law, repealing the 2011 law allowing casino gambling, and entitling certain employees to earn and utilize sick days. Please tell us your position on each of these and your reasons for taking the position.
Thank you. The first one is about, there was a law passed by the legislature increasing the gas tax, which right now is in the low 20s. It hadn't changed in quite a long time. We're actually in the middle of the pack in terms of our Massachusetts gas tax, so that gets added at the pump. There's also a federal tax as well. All of this is going into our transportation system. And again, transportation is a very serious issue that the legislature addressed to some degree in the last couple of sessions. Governor Patrick wanted a more expansive set of revenues going into transportation. We're seeing some of that with our big local project across the Merrimack River with Route 95. I'm going to vote against repealing that law. The major issue that people have is around the indexing, meaning it will increase incrementally based on cost of living. I don't have a huge problem with that. If I'm elected to the legislature, and there was no indexing, I think an annual increase very incrementally to that would be helpful and help our transportation system. Second question is about the beverage container recycling law, that's also known as the bottle bill. That's been around for many years. It needs updating to reflect the fact that we're using plastics and bottling for a whole bunch of different beverages than we did back in the day. Those of us who've been talking about plastic here in Newburyport know that we have a bag issue, but we also have a plastic bottle issue as well. So I would support expanding that law. Casino gambling, if you'd asked me this 2 years ago after that law had been passed, I would definitely vote to repeal casino gambling. I think at this point, just to use a colloquialism, the cat is out of the bag. There are plans, particularly for Springfield, that I think will help with the economic revitalization there. So I think I'd be a reluctant voter to keep casino gambling. It's also going to be a lot of revenue for the state and municipalities. Last one, I certainly favor increasing sick time for all employees.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
Thank you. So in terms of the gas tax, I think the problem that people have and what's prompted this bill is another broken promise for Boston. The gas tax, everybody understands, it's a user tax, use the roads, use gas, pay tax. Tax money would go to repair the roads. Everybody uses roads and sidewalks. It's got to be paid for in some way. Gas tax is the traditional way of doing it. The fact that it's been indexed, I think, is the appropriate thing to do. I'm not in favor of repealing what's on the books now, which does index it. In my own experience as a commissioner of Merrimack Valley Planning Commission for the last 12 years, we handle a lot of transportation matters, and the projects that can't get funded because there's just not enough money is astounding. In fact, we've all read on the federal level, the Highway Trust Fund is going to be exhausted unless Congress can somehow break a deadlock and get it straightened out. They kick the can down the road, but getting back to this question, we should not repeal it. I'm not in favor of repealing it. In terms of the bottle bill, I almost wanted to hide my bottle here, but it was provided to me by the, but the answer is really recycling, and expanding the bottle bill is fine. I'm not opposed to that at all. In terms of casino gambling, again, some people have an addiction to gambling, but the same can be said for other vices that we humans fall subject to. Like it or not, casino gambling is a form of entertainment for a lot of people, It's discretionary income that's spent that basically turns back into economic development funding. So it's here. I don't think it should be repealed. And finally, on sick days, again, it's hard to be opposed to that. A lot of us in regular employment, we enjoy sick days. Nobody enjoys when they get abused, but this is just to set a playing field that doesn't exist now. It's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Rebuttal?
Yeah, just to add on the sick time, I mean, yet again, it's going to be another burden on businesses, and you know, for the McDonald's and the Burger Kings and the Wendy's, you know, that's not so much of an issue, but the way it's crafted, it's going to have less of an impact on small businesses. To get back to what I was saying earlier about single payer health insurance, I think if you were an alien or a time traveler and you looked at the American healthcare system that is basically funded by employers and somewhat by employees with co-share, you know, splitting the premiums, I think it's really an insane system, and I think it's a real inhibitor on businesses bringing on additional employees. Again, I'd like to have that conversation about universal, about single payer. Some people call that Medicare for all. Medicare is one of the things the government has done well. And I think if we could take some of that burden off of businesses and unleash their creativity if they want to bring on more employees and not have to pay $15,000 or $20,000 for a family plan, I think that'd be a great way to spur economic development.
Thank you, Mr. Lavoie.
Just getting back to the first question, the gas tax again, nobody likes to pay taxes, but I think everybody in the room would agree, you know, it's important to pay your fair share, and if the only way to eliminate the stagnation that occurs where people are too cowardly to vote additional money for transportation, then indexing was the right thing to do. And as long as the state keeps its promise that these funds will be used to repair roads, I don't think deep in everyone's heart they have any problem with indexing the gas tax.
Thank you. Just to let you all know that we have a gentleman in the front. If you keep hearing a phone, it's not somebody not shutting off their phone and respecting Charlie's wishes. He's actually our timer, which has been incredibly important for us. So if you hear that little beep, that's reminding us and reminding the candidates that their time is at the end. So I apologize, I didn't let you all know that at the beginning of the evening. Okay, so these are the questions that Rebecca and Charlie have collected, and I will do my best to read them. Rebecca and I just went over them, so I think I have it pretty good. We will still go in the same swapping back and forth. The last one was Mr. Cameron, so we'll start with Mr. Lavoie. Name one position you have taken as a city councilor that you'd like to change or have changed, and why?
I've never made a mistake. That's a tough question because as part of a deliberative body, the whole purpose of having 9 people on our council, I know there's 11 in the report in Salisbury, there are 5 selectmen. The whole purpose of having a legislative body is so that not just one person is making a decision. Honestly, the most controversial thing we've probably done in Amesbury in 15 months is to try to raise salaries at the last minute. Under our charter, we only have 18 months to raise the mayor's salary and the legislative salaries. Amesbury is, you know, the mayor's at 80,000, and you know the city council has been at 3,000, you know, for a while. You know, people ask, why do you do the job? And you know, luckily I don't often ask myself that, because it's just, you know, it basically, for those of us that are doing it, for, you know, why we would want to be state representative, you know, it's just important to us. It comes natural. It's breathing, helping people. It just becomes natural. So getting back to the question, in terms of, you know, a vote that I may have done differently, I'm still in favor of, you know, the job is worth what it should be paid. But I definitely wouldn't go through that cycle again of trying to squeeze it in at the last minute. But part of the same thing about taxes affects salaries. Is basically there's not a lot of political courage to stand up for what's appropriate and right. And a lot of times at the end, you just basically throw in the towel because, you know, people just don't want to fight the battle. But there are some battles worth fighting, and I try to do my best.
Thank you. Will it be helpful if I reread the question between each time, because I know you're just getting these. You're good with this one? Okay. Let me know if you'd like me to reread them.
So the question is there a vote that I've regretted? You know, first of all, you know, we're going to make mistakes, whether that's at the local level or state level or national level. I think the important thing, as it is the rest of life, is to learn from your mistake, try to keep an open mind. You know, I certainly am open to additional input after we take votes. I've certainly felt like I've taken the lead on some very controversial causes here in Newburyport. The meals tax didn't get a lot of warm reception when I proposed that. Taking the marshal and fire chief out of civil service did not get a lot of warmth reception there, and eventually we passed that a term later. Historic preservation, very controversial. We were able to get to a good place where there was a lot of compromise. The one vote I do regret was one of the early ones I took in 2008, and that was around the wind turbine ordinance. I was the chair of the city's planning and development committee at the time. I think our intent was good. We wanted to help somebody build that big windmill that you see in Newburyport's industrial park. And I think we didn't vet it properly enough. I don't think there was enough mitigation for people who did have real impacts in terms of shadowing and flutter and a little bit of noise. We were one of the earlier communities out of the gate. In my life, I tend to like to see somebody else, you know, jump off the bridge first and see what happens before I decide to take a leap. We did modify it a little bit a year later, but I still think that was one that should have been vetted a little more carefully. We somehow had pressure to get it done, and I think we could have done a better job.
Thank you. Not sure if we have to do a rebuttal, but
Yeah, I'd like, as I've been sitting here with more time to think, I'll amend my prior answer to say this, that there's something I wish I had done that I was persuaded not to bring forward a bill on, and that's in Amesbury, we have a sports park, and we have great facilities for running large events. They usually do a good job. The last time they didn't do a good job was the egg drop a couple of years ago, which tied up the whole traffic system. It was dangerous. You get a helicopter dropping eggs and little kids running around. It wasn't a good idea. I brought forward a proposal that, you know, we should have some large event licensing going on so that there's a checklist and somebody checking it over. And I was dissuaded by members of the administration that, you know, we don't need that kind of overkill. It's, you know, it's handcuffs on the sports park. Well, this past couple of weeks, we've seen the results of, you know, I'm not for over-regulation, but I'm certainly not opposed to correct regulation. I've done my share of it, and I wish we had done it then. As a result, you know, we're going to have to do it now. So.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
I'm good.
Okay. Next question to Mr. Cameron first. Who are you supporting for governor and why?
Governor, is that this year? Okay. Yeah, great question. I'm supporting Steve Grossman. He is somebody that has grown on me. I've been the MC of the Democratic 3T2 City annual breakfast for the last number of years, so I've gotten to know Treasurer Grossman starting back in 2010 when he first ran for state office as treasurer. Somebody who I thought was kind of stodgy, not that flashy. He grew on me. He always came early. He often brought family and grandchildren. He always stayed late. He always got to know people. When he'd see you the following year, he'd remember you. I got the chance to see him in Lowell about a year ago at an event about elderly homelessness. And so seniors on fixed income, unfortunately, often have a hard time maintaining their housing, and homelessness is a reality for them. He came to talk about some of the budgeting and you know, efforts he'd made as treasurer to try to help seniors manage their money. He remembered me from that breakfast, and we invited him to the agency I work at, Community Teamwork. This was on an official treasurer visit. We emailed him a packet of information about our programs. He came without a note. He was reciting basically all of our materials. He met with kids in our Women, Infant, and Children program. He met with families who were getting fuel assistance, and he was just absolutely terrific. He did an interview on the local radio station, WCAP in Lowell, and talked about our agency, Community Teamwork. About 15 minutes after that radio interview, this is all in the space of an hour, he called me on my cell phone to say, "Ed, did you hear me on the radio?" I said, "Yes, I did. How did I do? How did I answer that question about homelessness?" And here's a fairly high-ranking politician who was looking for honest feedback, whether it be critical or positive, and I thought, that's my guy. So I hope he'll do well. We've got other good candidates, both Attorney General Coakley and Don Berwick, I think are great, and we'll see what happens, but I'm supporting Steve Grossman.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
Well, I'm supporting Martha Coakley. She and I went to law school together, so I've known her for 35 years. I think everyone would agree she's been a fantastic Attorney General. She has set her sights on being governor. I think she has a great legal mind. I think she can do a great job as governor. She's certainly not the most flashy politician, but in terms of being courageous and standing up for things not only that she believes in, but a lot of us, think it's the right thing to do. She's shown a lot of courage under fire, and when she sets her mind to something, it will get done. This is a tough year because Mr. Grossman also brings great credentials to the race. Like Ed, I've heard him speak a number of times. He has a wonderful background. He is a very good politician in terms of listening, more than he speaks, and he definitely brings it home in terms of remembering who you are and what's important to you. But every good elected official has that talent. I think Martha Coakley can do the job. I'm supporting her. I was hoping to wait until next Tuesday to get in the voting booth and going, this is a tough one. But as I said, I've known Martha for a long time. I think she can do the job, and I'm looking forward to having her be the nominee.
Thank you. Bo?
Just to add, in terms of Treasurer Grossman, I'm also liking his emphasis on economic growth, something we talked about, all tonight in terms of our region. He really gets it from a small business perspective. He talks quite eloquently about businesses' responsibilities to their employees, and he really lives that. And I've known some people that have worked for his company. If somebody's sick, he takes care of them. If somebody needs to take some time off to attend to an ailing elderly parent, he's done that. He also talks about something that I want to mention in terms of our region, and that's the importance of arts and history here. He talks a lot about how arts and humanities really are economic drivers for Massachusetts, and I think that really applies to these communities. Door knocking, you meet a lot of artists who are struggling to do their thing and still be able to live in the region because it's expensive in Massachusetts, but I think that's a real economic bit of differentiation between us and a lot of other places in the country.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
I'd just say people should look at Martha Coakley's record. She is courageous. She stands up for the right things, and she may not always prevail, but she has a good head on her shoulders.
Thank you. Next question to Mr. Lavoie first. What will you do to reduce homelessness in the district?
Well, the key to eliminating homelessness is provide affordable housing. And that was one of our earlier questions in terms of whether or not we support something called Chapter 40B. Chapter 40B provides that every community, in order to carry its own weight around the state, should provide 10% of its housing stock to be affordable. And most of our municipalities in Massachusetts never make that standard. And when you fall below 10%, then your municipality becomes eligible. It's more like, subject to the ability of developers to set the agenda in terms of where and how affordable housing should be built. Every municipality has the ability to do what's called local initiative plans, and I think there are more basic functions that we all focus on. Even though education is critical, public safety is probably the prime local function that we all care about. We want to be safe. We want to be have an ambulance ready to take us. We want our homes to be protected from fire. But homelessness is a large problem. The way it's addressed is to provide affordable housing, and 40B is a way of getting us there. On the local level, there's a lot that can be done in terms of forming housing trusts, which on the Amesbury Council I was asked to help. I formed the housing trust, wrote it, got it passed. It still needs to come to fruition because finding those funds among all the competing funds is very difficult. But a home, having a home is the key central issue that allows, if you have a home, you have a base from which to work. So ending homelessness is.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you. Great simple question, multifaceted answer. Basically in Massachusetts, our solution to homelessness for the last 20 or so years has been sheltering families and sheltering individuals. And people can become homeless for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes substance abuse, mental health, dislocation from family. Each night in Massachusetts, there are over 2,000 families that are in shelters, and then there's another 2,000 families that are staying in hotels. It's about 150 of the Merrimack Valley and staying in hotels in Chelmsford, in Methuen, in Haverhill. We spend several hundred million dollars each year, so it's a big expense, so it should be of concern to anyone, certainly for compassion reasons, but as a budget concern, certainly should be addressed. I agree with Bob, 40B and affordable housing are a big part of the solution. It's very difficult to build in Massachusetts. 40B was an attempt back in 1968 to try to rectify and get around some of our more onerous local zoning. I think there needs to be a lot more done to work with communities around denser development, around transit, just to connect people where they live to jobs in the community. So work, for example, the Route 1 effort right now that the city of Newburyport's undergoing is a step in the right direction. But it's really the economic reasons, the minimum wage, earned sick time. A lot of times those are reasons that people get behind on their rent. In addition, we haven't talked about things like substance abuse, mental health, and the whole range of domestic violence issues that those are undermining families' abilities to stay together and to stay self-sufficient. In terms of substance abuse, there's a huge issue with heroin and opioid addiction. Prescription drugs are a big part of that, leading on to other illegal drugs. Let's face it, we're the pharmaceutical nation of the world. And there's a lot of ways for people to get into harder drugs, and we've seen a lot of deaths here in all three communities because of heroin overdoses. So I think coming to work on all of those issues together is how we're going to come to grips with homelessness.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
The only thing I'd like to add is that like many things, we all know it's the right thing to do, to be our brother's keeper, to help those who can't provide for themselves, to help them get the basic necessities, of which housing is right up there after food, clothing, then comes shelter. But we also need to be careful to avoid some of the unintended consequences. A lot of our municipalities, I don't think our three in our district are suffer from it, but towns like Danvers, where there are large homeless populations that are housed in the hotels and otherwise, the burden on the local schools, and not only the local schools, but the education budget from having to pay for out-of-district services eats into like other things, eats into the education budget. And the one thing about our district is they are generous to a fault when it comes to schools. Newburyport itself voted the 2 new schools. Amesbury has always passed every override for schools. So we care about education, but the unintended consequences of doing something as good as correcting homelessness does have to be watched to make sure it doesn't have the unintended consequences I just
Cameron?
I'd also add, both from a private personal perspective and from state government's perspective, is supporting local institutions that are really in the trenches working with families. Salvation Army, Roof Overhead, the YWCA, Pettingill House, Our Neighbor's Table. They're dealing each day, every night, every meal, or every grocery bag that they give out with the folks that are in our communities that really are having a hard time getting by. You know, one of the great things about being a candidate is it forces you to go knock on doors and go into, you know, and meet people that you otherwise might not have met. And when you really take a hard look, you know, you see rundown housing in all three communities, and behind there, you know, it might be an elderly person on fixed income, might be a single mom struggling to get her child through school and you know, working at Marshall's or Market Basket, that kind of thing. And so those local institutions really do a great and important job just to keep everybody afloat. Is we need to try to level the playing field and make it easier for everyone to be successful.
Thank you. Next question to you, Mr. Cameron first. What about giving the arts much more attention and importance in funding?
As I mentioned a few minutes ago in regards to Steve Grossman, the Mass Cultural Council funding, which is, you know, has small grants, you know, micro grants that help local art and music institutions. That's been cut a lot in the state budget. We've had our ups and downs with the state budget back in the 2002 era, then again in 2008. I think that's a wise investment for us as a community. I know was talking to some folks earlier today in the James Steam Mill, and that topic came up about supporting artists and artist housing. I know that's been done in other parts of the Commonwealth, for example, the Fort Point community down in Boston, where there was creation of a lot of artist lofts and, you know, live workspaces. I think that's something we should look at. I know we have some of that in Amesbury, and we've got a little bit of that in Newburyport. I mean, I think that's a great way. Supporting arts and music in the schools is really important. You know, we need well-rounded students. It's a great way for them to take a little pressure off the rigors of academia by getting involved in music or expressing themselves through art. So I think those are important ways that we can do that through the schools. But again, supporting that Mass Cultural Council and those grants would be something I would be supporting.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
The arts in Amesbury is alive and well. One thing that was mentioned a minute ago was basically in Amesbury, our first economic development miracle, if you want to call it that, is the Upper Mill Yard. Anybody going through Amesbury now, you know, is amazed, you know, how the rebirth of downtown has occurred, and that's what we're trying to do with the Lower Mill Yard. In the Upper Mill Yard, we basically did have artists, lofts, work, live space as part of the Upper Mill Yard. We're going to continue it in the Lower Mill Yard. There are spaces there that are well suited for it. We're trying to get our carriage museum up and running. The Lower Mill Yard Task Force that I've been on since the inception of the Lower Mill Yard funding is working with the Carriage Alliance, which is our Chamber of Commerce and a couple of our museums, to work together to get a carriage museum down the Lower Mill Yard next to the Lower Mill Yard Park that the City Council voted. And it wasn't easy to get that funding passed in the City Council, but in Amesbury we had created a new park in probably 2 generations. So yeah, we were able to get support built on the council. It's never easy to spend money, but when you can leverage local money with state money and end up with a new park on the river, which would provide venues for performances and the like, I think it's a win-win solution.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron, rebuttal?
Yeah, again, I think those sort of local projects are important, and Amesbury's doing a great job, and Bob's done a big part of that, and I think that's terrific. I know, you know, from time to time we have different opportunities in Newburyport. I'd like to learn more about Salisbury and the arts. That's something I would need to get up to speed on. And again, it's a part of a civil society, and it's incredibly important, you know, and you know, I'm the my wife will attest, I'm the least artistic person going. I'm a tiny bit musical, but not much better at that. But you know, we just we're in such a beautiful place, and I think art reflects that beauty. And you know, it's really what makes civilization tick.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
I couldn't agree more. New report is certainly the leader with the waterfront. The movies this summer were just fantastic. Again, it's listening to our better angels and providing a balanced approach to funding. As a state legislator, I would certainly continue the funding of local arts councils so that the good work that's already started locally in Salisbury, Newburyport, and Amesbury can continue.
Thank you. Next question to Mr. Lavoie. How will you address the issues with the Department of Children and Family Services?
That is certainly a large blemish on the bureaucracy of our state government. Oversight is key. That's one of the key functions of the State House, the legislature, between the House and the Senate, is to provide that oversight. And there are oversight committees that are dedicated to just that. And, although it's not one of my two key committee assignments, I mean, one thing that I've always done in my entire life is to volunteer, you know, and much to the chagrin usually of my family, but you know, when asked, you know, could you help, I certainly would. The oversight has to occur on the legislative level, but most importantly, it's got to come from the governor's office in terms of appointing the right people. The governor has to have some of his appointments approved, but for the most part, he staffs the agencies with the secretaries, and then you know, you can't walk away from it at that point in time. You've got to monitor it. So, as a state legislator, I would certainly gladly do my part to provide the oversight, and if asked to serve on such a committee or a commission to look into it, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you. So DCF is the Department of Children and Families. It was formerly known as the Department of Social Services. The name changed about 5 years ago. And it's really the state's agency that provides protective services and all sorts of other support services for children that are at risk and families that are going through turbulent times. Every night in Massachusetts, that agency is connecting with 30,000 children. That's how many registered voters there are in Amesbury, Newburyport, and Salisbury. That could fill up a good portion of Fenway Park. It's a huge problem that only hits the Boston Globe when somebody dies, and that happens unfortunately too often. But there are thousands of families that are having direct connections with DCF every day. Sometimes it's a kid runs out of an apartment unattended and runs out into the street, gets found by a local police officer. Sometimes it's a teacher reporting that. There's some sort of maltreatment or bruises. It happens every day, and it's really unfortunate because those kids carry those scars for the rest of their lives. I can tell you from working with homeless people over the years, a lot of them had those traumatic upbringings where their parents really did not do a good job acting in their best interest. Where we go from here is some of the steps that the legislature's taken, funding for caseload reduction. In the past, each of those caseworkers might have 19 or 20 families. That's been reduced to 15. We need to do a much better job of connecting with other state agencies like the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Public Health's Bureau of Substance Abuse Services. Again, as I said earlier, related to homelessness, a lot of times it's domestic violence, it's alcohol, other drugs, it's all of those issues combined are going on in these families, and kids are really traumatized because their parents can't take care of them. While some of this exists in families that are wealthy, often they have access to medical and mental health services that lower income people don't. So I think it's improving the safety net around mental health, around physical health, and substance abuse, and I think we can help those kids have better lives and better outcomes.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Mr. Lavoie?
Basically, it boils down to what resources we as a society need to make available to a whole multitude of issues. And if we have a static condition where there's no economic growth, then everybody's going to be squabbling over their piece of the pie, their pet project or their agency. And certainly Children's Services are right up there in terms of what's critical. The key really, to me, it comes back to economic development in terms of growing the pie so that there are more resources available for all services. And certainly DCF needs appropriate funding, but they also need appropriate oversight. And again, as a legislator, that's where I would head for.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
Yeah, again, just to, I do want to echo what Bob said around the economic development connection. Families want to work. It's difficult, particularly for single parent families. Transportation, which is an issue for anyone, regardless of your income, is a real issue for people that don't have enough money for cars. Need to use local regional transit to get around. And again, a lot of those folks are living, maybe in the audience right now, but just having economic difficulties, and they're certainly in our community. So I think things like the minimum wage, I think earned sick time, those are important to support those families. And if we have a more robust economy, people can have jobs that'll pay $15 an hour, and they can afford the $1,200 rents. And because it's tough for single income heads of households. So I think we can do more and let them, they're going to do most of the work, but I think we can try to level the playing field and make it a strong economy for them.
Thank you. Next question to Mr. Cameron. What is your view on marijuana legalization for non-medical use?
What is my opinion on marijuana legalization for non-medical use?
Yes.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a ballot initiative in the next couple of years. I think we need to do a much better job with the rollout of the dispensaries and the production facilities. I know that's been a little contentious at the local level. I think the state has really mishandled that. I'd like to see us take a look at what's happening in Colorado and in Washington, which are the first two states that have legalized the recreational use. But I think it's going to come, and I think the difficulty around it is when we use the word drug, it has a very heavy connotation. But the reality is things like marijuana. I don't believe it's a gateway drug because somebody smokes marijuana doesn't mean they're going to go to heroin use. I think prescription drugs can often be a gateway to more serious drug problems. Marijuana, I suppose it can be used in a way that is recreational, for lack of a better word, without increased harm on a person's well-being and on society. And I'd rather focus less on marijuana and focus a lot more on harder drugs and heroin and crystal meth and coke and other things that really have impacts both on crime but also on physical health for people. Shift away from criminalizing marijuana to really criminalizing the use of those harder drugs, and particularly those that are dealing those or producing those or bringing those into the country, and really focus on what is causing the most damage. So to answer your question, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie.
Well, I'll start the answer by this, talking about medical marijuana, which I think we're all much more versed in. I did not vote for that referendum question. However, 62% of Massachusetts voted in favor. My own community, Amesbury, I think was 67%, because the people who are in the medical world are convinced that medical marijuana has beneficial uses. Most importantly to me is that society, the voters, decided they would take that step. So we've all been wrestling with it in Amesbury, where we were convinced we had wanted nothing to do with dispensaries. As far as growing this stuff, it's basically a manufacturing operation, totally enclosed. A lot of manufacturing going on in all three of our municipalities. So leading into really the recreational use of marijuana, I'm torn in terms of, you could tell I'm a little bit more of a traditionalist than some other people, but it just doesn't seem right. I don't want Massachusetts to become Colorado. On the other hand, the war on drugs, I talked earlier about unintended consequences. The unintended consequences of our war on drugs has ruined a lot of lives needlessly, and people are in jail now for things that you'd pay a $300 fine for. So I think society is coming along. I hope when that question does hit as a referendum, it will be more than a couple of years down the road. But society does evolve. All of us are changing our attitudes. And if you're locked into a certain attitude in the face of experience, then you're not a thinking person. So my answer is I'm not in favor of it at this time. Could I change as times change? Maybe.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
See, this is one of those questions I wish Bob had gone first. Yeah. Give me a little time to come up with a thoughtful response. I'll add one thing. Actually, I'll add two things. Yeah, in terms of the war on drugs, yeah, a lot of lives have been damaged because of the over-criminalization of certain substances that maybe not all that harmful, and others that were. You kind of punish both at the same level, and it's made a lot of money for drug dealers. It's made a lot of money for Mexican and Colombian cartels. It's caused an incredible amount of violence in other parts of the world: Mexico, Colombia, Afghanistan, the other Golden Triangle, which is in Southeast Asia. Is a big source of a lot of the heroin that comes into this country. So we need to be smarter in that so-called war on drugs. And I'd certainly be looking to follow the instincts of constituents on this matter. Again, I think it would be a vote on a ballot referendum. When I was knocking on doors a couple of months ago in Newburyport on Prospect Street, a gentleman who was having some difficulties getting out of his car with his groceries. His question to me was, what's your stance on legalizing marijuana? And he went on to say that he was very much in favor of medical marijuana. It was something that he found helpful. And he physically had some autoimmune issues and stiffness that were helped by that. And since you kind of have to come up with an answer, I said, I think if we could get it right, I think I would be in support of legalization. It wouldn't be something I'd lead with as a priority, certainly at the State House, but I would be looking to follow the lead of constituents.
Thank you. Mr. Lavoie?
Well, I can imagine only that 70 years ago when Prohibition was the rage, that candidates sat at a table in this room and were asked a question about that. But the difference to me is that, since society began 10,000 years ago, people discovered alcohol. So we've had a longer history of dealing with alcohol. And I like to think of it in terms of behavior. People are responsible for their own conduct and behavior. And even though alcohol is legal, if you misbehave with it, you're responsible and have to be accountable. And I presume that if marijuana ever gets legalized, that same type of accountability for behavior will be installed.
Thank you. It's now 8:30. There are two more questions from the audience. So I guess, Charlie, this question, and Rebecca, this is to you on whether I should go forward with those two to close out the night or stay true to the...
I could see people's faces. I think you might want to just do one.
Always compromise.
What do you think about what does Bob want to do?
No, I don't see people itching in their seats, but I think one more question is certainly merited, sir.
Thank you.
We have
Just have to each talk once instead.
Yeah.
Okay, no rebuttals?
Yeah.
It's great compromise. Okay. So this is to Mr. Lavoie. One thing that joins the three communities together is the growing network of bike and walking trails. There are several missing links in the network. What are the barriers and how might you help overcome them?
That's a great question, because I attended a lunch in Amesbury about 3 years ago, and the title of it was The Missing Link. And there is a section of the trail between the Salisbury Ghost Trail and downtown Amesbury. And believe it or not, there's a bridge that runs under 95 in the Elm Street area, the old Elm Street in Salisbury and the Elm Street in Amesbury. And I've walked that bridge. It's an interesting structure. I think that connecting our communities that way is fantastic. My work on the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, where I chaired it for 5 years and been vice chair for almost that amount of time, we spent a lot of time with facilitating trails and finding the financing to make it work. The bridge project, the Whittier Bridge project, is a pretty expensive proposition. It's just under $300 million, but it has received expedited treatment. Believe it or not, it's 41% complete now, and even then the completion date is 2016, but it went back to the drawing board just so that we're going to be the second in the nation to have an interstate bridge facility that has a pedestrian bike link. And it did add millions to the project, but again, in terms of, I mean, think about it. When the Whittier Bridge, it was probably a marvel for our parents when it was built in the 50s. This bridge is likely to last, the same period of time, 50 or so years. So the additional funds, even though, at first glance you go, $10 million for connection, but the enhancement of the quality of life is going to be fantastic. We're all out walking more. Some of our favorite activities around town are enjoying the trails. It's a big priority for all 3 cities and towns, and at the State House, if elected, that'll be another one of my priorities, because just as economic development is different in all 3 communities, the tourism and the ability for people to use the trails is critical.
Thank you. Mr. Cameron?
I think Bob did a nice job of summing it up. I think that connectivity from those trails is bearing fruit already to the limited degree that it's all connected into one piece. Certainly, I think we all should appreciate the efforts that Mayor Holliday and Mayor Keyser and Manager Harrington did, along with Katie Ives and Mike Costello and C. Bedore even before, to work with DOT to get that pedestrian part added to the Whittier Bridge. As Bob said, it does cost money, but the reality is in the private sector, corporations lavish all sorts of money on buildings and building projects and corporate suites. Why can't we have decent facilities as well? So I think that's going to be money well spent. Hopefully this bridge will last longer than the 50 years that this one did, but I think if we do it right, it will, and it'll be a real testament to what we can do when we spend our tax dollars wisely and on a project that we all are in agreement on. The trails, certainly are lower tech than a fancy bridge, but I think it's great to encourage bicycle usage. I think if we can do better connections to commuter rail and even to the bus service within town, if we can get the Merrimack Valley Regional Transit Authority to take bikes on some of their buses, maybe you could get an easier ride out to Salisbury Beach or connect with Haverhill, and you might not want to be able to bike all the way to Haverhill, but just to have that option, I think, encourages that biking potential. I think trails are similar to what some people are pushing locally, called a concept called complete streets, and that's really making all of our streets and roadways easier for pedestrians, easier for people with strollers, easier for people with wheelchairs, easier for bicyclists, to make it safer to get around without your car. Car-free day will be coming up in Newburyport soon, and I think encouraging the trail usage is a great way to emphasize that and emphasize our environmental inclinations.
Thank you. So now we're at the point of the closing remarks. So we started out with Mr. Lavoie, so we'll end first with Mr. Lavoie and then Mr. Cameron. So closing remarks, Mr. Lavoie.
Thank you. Thank you for the great job you've done tonight. Again, thank you for the audience for being here. This is my first opportunity to participate in a debate like this, and I think the audience has been very attentive and appreciated. So to sum up my candidacy, I'm ready for this opportunity. I've been preparing all my life. I think I'm cut out to do the work. People who know me on the Amesbury City Council know that whatever time it takes, I put in to do the job. I do have a tremendous facility, so I've been told, that I can help people find solutions. And as I mentioned earlier, the inability for people to reach across the aisle, the inability to, no one's asked to give up their principles, but common ground can always be found, and I have a great talent for that. And the state legislature is just another extension of the legislative bodies that we have in our cities and towns. And I've done, I think, yeoman's work on the Amesbury City Council. I have a great track record. I'm happy to run on it. I've saved the town of Amesbury $2.1 million by basically thinking outside the box. And even having done that, Mayor Keyser would tell you, it took 3 times at his kitchen table to convince him that, all right, I wanted to do it my way, but your way will save us $2.1 million. And the council, who's the guardian of the purse, didn't want to spend more money than it had to, and I found a way to do that. I have a great interest in doing this job. I think I'd be good at it. I asked on September 9th if you'd consider me with your vote. I hope I've earned it. If I haven't yet, and you have any questions, I'm glad to make myself available. I've met a lot of people throughout the 3 communities. I've spent a lot of time out and about listening, and I think that's critical, whether before or after election, to always listen to the constituents.
Thank you, Ms. Lavoie. Mr. Cameron?
Thank you, Ron Lee, and thank you to the committees, and thank you all for being here. And I think it's been a very informative night. It's been a chance for both of us to express our views and what we've learned on the campaign trail, and try to talk to you about why each of us thinks we'd be a good public servant for you, and want to thank Bob. It's been great getting to know him on the campaign trail. What I've learned in my door knocking and in my meeting with voters is really what I want to reflect at the State House, and that's a higher vision for state government that works better for us, that is very customer service oriented, and that provides for state support for education so we can educate our kids without busting our local city and town budgets. We're looking for economic development that is going to bring jobs to these communities, that's going to provide more opportunity to us to broaden our tax base so that there's less impact on local property taxpayers, that can improve transportation systems, so whether it's moving around within the district between Amesbury, Salisbury, and Newburyport, or commuting to Boston or commuting elsewhere down 495, that we have the road services and the commuter rail and the buses in place so we can basically live our lives, go to work, take care of our families, and come back and enjoy a beautiful sunset in an incredible area. We are really blessed to be in a place like this. I grew up South Shore in Bridgewater, a town not dissimilar from these 3 communities. And I can tell you from living in a few places in Massachusetts, this is really an incredible gem. Whether you're a lifelong resident or you just moved here, you know how lucky we all are. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I work well with others. I have a lot of Republican support. I have unenrolled support. I have a little bit of Tea Party support. And I hope I have the support of Democrats that I've gotten to know over the last several years. I'm interested in not fixing problems only, but in capitalizing on our opportunities. I think all of these communities have some incredible potential with projects, and I want to be a part of being your voice at the State House. I thank you for being here tonight, and I'm asking for your vote next Tuesday, September 9th. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron.